Chaotic early signing week and just a chaotic time of year. We look back at some of what happened this week in Lane Kiffin's first signing class, first couple days of signing. It was certainly not without some drama and some excitement by the end of it in particular. And we start turning our page a little bit into the Superdome and state championships next week. This is Louisiana versus Loyals Recruit That Boot. I'm Jed Roser. He's Sam Spiegelman. Sam, how we doing? How we holding up over there? Just managing way too many things happening at the same time.
This is the best time of the year. This is the first time on the Recruit That Booth podcast we've even said Lane Kiffin. Believe it or not, this is the only medium in the entire world that has not mentioned Lane Kiffin. I saw it be talked about on CNN. So we're late to the party, but we got all the scoop of how the week went and everything that went down, including the latest on where Lane Kiffin's staff in Baton Rouge is basically almost complete at this point. And there's some notable hires on there that's going to instantly impact the recruiting trail. But really, it's the best time of the year because our dome matchups are set. That plane is boarding at 8 o'clock on Wednesday night, and I will be there 5 hours early, just counting down. I'm already looking at these matchups. I told you off air. I am stoked. The signing period was fun. It was eventful. It was probably the most hectic National Signing Day week in at least 4 or 5 years off the top of my head. And I'm still just stoked that it's behind us because we got some of these prime time games in the Superdome this week, which is our favorite time of the year.
No doubt. So much to get to, not all that much time to get into it, but we're going to get to what we can for sure. And let's start with that LSU signing class and the way some of these things came together. That was, national headline worthy this week as, we saw some guys out of that LSU class late. We saw some guys in. We saw some delays. I think we had more drama stretching into Friday in an early signing period than I can remember since they instituted that thing a few years back. And so let's start with the Big Rich and Lamar Brown of it all. That was kind of naturally the headline that was kind of carrying through the week. The top two prospects in the state of Louisiana. Lane Kiffin comes in. There's still some staff uncertainty. These two guys have been locked and loaded to LSU for quite some time. And then we kind of get the sense going into the week, hey, there may be some questions to be answered, some things to be figured out. There's late night secret meetings Tuesday night and calls every single day. And finally, Thursday, the paperwork comes in for Rich. Friday, the paperwork comes in for Lamar Brown. What the heck happened there to get this thing over the finish line?
Yeah, from speaking to those young men, their high school coaches, their agents, they had a lot of really positive things to say, not only about new head coach Lane Kiffin, but new general manager Billy Glasscock, who we know. I don't know much of his background. I don't know him personally. I know he was at Texas, and I know what he was able to, build out there in Oxford. But hearing, coaches like Bryce Brown and agents and kids like Lamar talk about Billy Glasscock about in that capacity. If I'm an LSU fan, I'm pretty excited about what they're doing over there. In a matter of days, Lane Kiffin is able to get Lamar Brown, the number one player in the country, go from potentially waiting to see how he builds out his staff and potentially sign in February to then signing technically Thursday late night and going public on Friday. And of course, we know Big Rich Anderson, who was a mid-year graduate, so was intending to sign, gets him over the top, not knowing what Frank Wilson, his lead recruiter's role, was going to be in Baton Rouge or even in that city moving forward. You have to take your hats off to Lane Kiffin and Billy Glasscock for able to assemble this staff, get their message quickly delivered, and really impress some central figures here. The agents of, like you said, the top two prospects in the country. These are two top 20 prospects in the country, including the number one prospect and the number one defensive line prospect, but also going and get a couple of familiar faces. We know about Braden Allen, a late offer, but has had such a sensational senior season for LCA. Going to get Corey Barber Jr. out of Alabama, who was one of George McDonald's, the new wide receiver coach in Baton Rouge. His favorite targets of this recruiting cycle. Corey Barber isn't the biggest, but he might be the fastest wide receiver in this class. And he is a spark plug that I think is going to have an instant impact at LSU. Going to get a tight end, which was much needed. Going to get some offensive line upgrades and really maintaining that defensive line haul that is so special. People came for Trenton Henderson and Deuce Gerald, just like we've alluded to on this podcast. The in-state guys were likely to sign, but the out-of-state guys would be hot topics with changes at Auburn, at Florida, new staff changes at Florida State. For LSU, for Lane Kiffin and this staff to be able to hold on to not only the in-state nucleus, but hold on to a couple of those key blue chippers from Florida and Georgia. This is a really exciting class and a really job well done, getting this all done in a matter of 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, I mean, look, 14 guys signed during the early period for LSU right now, and they are really high quality guys when you look at just, I mean, the rankings of them across the board. And so a fantastic foundation, especially when you consider that tight timeline. And now, I mean, you know Lane Kiffin and modern NCAA football. They're going to go attack that transfer portal for some help. Probably offensive line will be an area that stands out. But they're going to, if this is the early indication of what this offseason is going to look like, it's definitely extremely encouraging. How much do we take from seeing Lamar sign, from seeing Rich sign, as it relates to Frank? That was a big kind of ongoing dynamic this week as we watch different prospects out of the class or into the class, was reading the tea leaves of what that meant for the coaches on that staff and who was coming and who was going and whatnot. And Frank became such a sticking point for the New Orleans coaches in particular, but he was huge for a lot of the recruiting process for these guys, including Lamar Brown right there on campus. How much is there to be read on this? Obviously, LSU managed, we find out late Friday night that Blake Baker's staying put. He's not going down to Tulane to be the head coach. We get reports that Corey Raymond is indeed going to be retained. Where do things stand with Frank? How much do we read from the recruiting class about the direction of some of that?
Yeah. Again, none of this is confirmed. This is just all what I've been hearing over the last 4 or 5 days. Frank Wilson is not going to be LSU's running backs coach next year.
Yeah.
I know that there are opportunities for him to stay in Baton Rouge in a different capacity. But from what I understand, Frank wants to continue to be an on-the-field coach. We saw a couple of these commitments flip to Ole Miss and sign. I would keep an eye on an old friend at Pete Golding from Hammond, Louisiana, now the head coach in Oxford, bringing in the number one recruiter in Louisiana to potentially be on his staff. But I think what we saw with Big Rich signing, with Lamar Brown signing, Frank Wilson was the lead recruiter in both of these recruitments. Blake Baker has also played extremely large roles in both of these recruitments, and Blake is going to be there. That continuity is looming incredibly large. And according to multiple reports, looks like Elijah Robinson is going to be the defensive line coach in Baton Rouge. And Elijah Robinson is famous for LSU fans as the guy who evaluated and offered and landed commitments from such blue chippers you might know as Dominic McKinley and Gabriel Relaford when he was at A&M. Got a demotion in Syracuse, but widely considered by most around the country as one of the top defensive line coaches in America. And LSU has not had people might get mad at me, has not had a legitimate defensive line coach since Jamar Cain was on this staff. They've had a lot of shoe-ins, a lot of fill-ins, and they've been able to make up for that with Blake Baker, one of the top 1 or 2 defensive coordinators in the country, and of course Frank Wilson, just an excellent recruiter. But now these defensive line prospects like Lamar and Big Rich know that Blake and Elijah Robinson are going to be on the staff. So the development, the competitiveness, the growth, that's all going to be available to them. It doesn't look like Frank Wilson is going to be a part of the staff, which could shake up some of the current LSU roster. I imagine since he was playing such a lead role with so many current LSU Tigers, they might follow him to his next stop, wherever that may be, even if it's elsewhere in the SEC. But I think it says a lot about the staff that Lane Kiffin is assembling. George McDonald, the wide receiver coach, able to sign Jabari Mack, able to make a splash with Corey Barber and Brayton Allen, with defensive line coach Elijah Robinson, keeping Big Rich and Trenton Henderson and Deuce Geralds and Lamar Brown on in this class. And then Corey Raymond, who we know is notorious for being the architect of DBU, has never wanted to coach anywhere but LSU. Him being a part of this bodes very well for, again, the continuity on this roster.
Yeah, and for landing Haven Finney there, because we've talked about Haven for 2 years now and how much he wanted to play for Corey Raymond and not just LSU but Corey Raymond at LSU. And so when that one came through late Wednesday, you started to feel that much more confidently about Corey and his status in Baton Rouge. As I mentioned, there's a ton to get to, and so we'll probably over the course of the next couple months, as this class for LSU continues to kind of finalize, be able to come back and hit on different themes and whatnot as we get more of a sense of what that final number and final group looks like. But let's mention Tulane in here too. Those guys signed 14 prospects this week, despite the fact that their head coach is now Florida's head coach. Their new head coach was still is, I guess, a conversation that's lingering until Friday. A lot of folks thought it was going to be Blake Baker, but that turned into Blake being retained in Baton Rouge, opting to stay with the Tigers, and this fantastic looking defense continuing to come together. How the heck did Tulane land more than a dozen guys with that much uncertainty still going into the weekend?
Yeah, John Summerall is going to Florida, and I think he is going to hit the ground running and be a huge fan favorite out there in the swamp. And I think he's going to recruit not only the state of Florida really well, but he's a guy from Alabama. And look how easily he recruited the state of Louisiana. So when he has the state of Florida in his back pocket, and him and his staff have been exceptional recruiting the entirety of the Southeast, I'm really excited about what's happening in Florida. I also love John Summerall as a person, and I think you can testify to that as well. He told those Tulane commits to stay committed to Tulane. I heard stuff beginning, I guess it was after his hire was made official Monday, that he was going to poach and bring a lot of Tulane commits with him to the swamp. And listen, people who on message boards who threw, I can't really do the emoji with my own face right now, but like all confused. John Summerall and that staff, Cole Hurd, the GM, they recruited SEC talent to Tulane. You see people go to the Tulane roster year in and year out to poach guys. Their quarterback just got paid over $1 million to do the same thing at Duke, and they're playing in the ACC championship game tonight. Their starting running back is going to be a factor for Oregon, which we expect to be a perennial contender. Not to mention guys like Shaz Preston are on this roster, who LSU, Alabama, and Texas would still drool over bringing back to town. I think whether it's Billy Napier or Will Hall, I've heard Shield Wood all be mentioned as Tulane, but they're going to inherit a really great class that definitely had the opportunity to go play elsewhere. A lot of schools came calling for these Tulane commits over the last week, trying to get something done, try to shake things up. And you need to credit that John Summerall and what Tulane has meant to him, that he's helping out the Green Wave sign this class. Like you said, 14 kids, not all of them intended to sign early, but John Summerall encouraged them to, which that is just not typical in today's day and age.
Yeah, the one in-state guy, need a shout out, Tylen George. He was someone that thought he was going to at least hold off, if not potentially flip, and he ends up coming in here in the last couple of days. And so I think that's a huge one. I love him as an interior offensive lineman here moving forward at the next level. Hitting on a couple of, and wanted to mention the Cajuns as well. I think it was a nice signing day for those guys to be able to ink 21 without a whole hell of a lot of drama, 14 in-state guys. And so nice job by Coach Dez and company out there. Some notable signees up in Ruston at Louisiana Tech, ULM, really JUCO heavy. Adding a couple of in-state guys. And so, we always love to see anytime ULM makes that move with some in-state guys, but definitely a JUCO heavy class up there for Coach Vincent and company. But looking at a couple of in-state guys that had notable changes, of course, here this week, Kenny Darby was part of this LSU class. He's now heading to Kentucky. Cole Bergeron was heading to Virginia Tech until early in the week before, a new quarterback commit that James Franklin pulls from his old Penn State class. Cole is now heading to Georgia Tech. Let's start with Kenny. Just how did that play out, and how is he feeling about the pivot to go up to the Bluegrass?
Yeah, this was a little bit of a shocker. We know that Lane Kiffin and Billy Glasscock were going to put their stamp on the LSU 2026 class, and with that, sometimes comes casualties. We saw Jalen Chapman decommit pretty shortly after, and we saw the same from Kenny Darby, which is a little bit of a head scratcher. Don't get me wrong, but everyone's entitled to their own evaluations. We saw how Lane Kiffin and company quickly bolstered their receiving class with Braden Allen and Corey Barber, and that ultimately led to Kenny Darby exploring his options. We know that Coach Prime made a strong run at bringing him up to Boulder. Mississippi State was hopeful to get him back in the fold, but we saw an old familiar face, Joe Sloan, say, "I'm still the mayor of Shreveport. That'll. I'm bringing that to BBN," and I loved it. I think Kenny Darby is an SEC player. I think he's a fantastic number 2 wide receiver on a really potent offense. And, I know that he really wanted to be a Tiger, but I'm really happy that he found a landing spot where with Will Stein and Joe Sloan digraphing and calling plays, I think he is going to be in a great spot. I love that Joe Sloan went out there and recruited his guy. He played such a central role in recruiting Kenny Darby to LSU, and multiple times Kenny Darby flirted with other schools like Alabama, to name one. So for Kentucky to make that late move, beat teams that are closer in proximity, I thought that was a nice get for our boy Joe Sloan and the Wildcats as they start to put their touch on this new look Kentucky Wildcat program.
Some of what we saw with these in-state guys on Tuesday, like a Kenny or a Jalen who had been so set on LSU for so long, are aspects that I totally understand from a business standpoint and needing to make your own roster and have your own player evaluations and whatnot. But obviously us as close as we are to, to the grassroots of it all and to knowing all these kids, I just struggle with so much. But I know that thankfully, all 3 of the guys that were committed have great opportunities now. Kervin Johnson, Jalen Chapman heading to Ole Miss, Kenny, as we mentioned, heading up to Kentucky. And I think there are, certainly some, again, great opportunities for those guys in their immediate future here. Cole Bergeron, Georgia Tech was big in the mix with him before that Virginia Tech commitment. Minnesota came in and was really pushing a ton late. The Yellow Jackets,
our daily dog of the day.
The Yellow Jackets are, in fact, able to finally get their man there late, the top-ranked quarterback in the state of Louisiana. So a kind of similar dynamic where a late pivot of college plans there, but Cole Bergeron is now Georgia Tech bound. We've talked about him a bunch on here, but what do Yellow Jackets fans need to know about the quarterback they're getting? And how did this play out for Georgia Tech to beat out Minnesota and some of these other programs down the stretch?
The background, that's the Georgia Tech fans barking for their newest dog. I love this for Georgia Tech.
Well done.
Thank you. I thought all 13 seconds about how to transition for that one. Really interesting scenario for the past 10-ish days for Cole Bergeron and his family being loyal and staying committed to Virginia Tech through a coaching change that started in September. James Franklin brings him back in for an official visit. And at the same time, Minnesota, which was trending to flip him, takes Carson Palmer's son, Brady Palmer. They need a quarterback. Virginia Tech then adds a commitment from Troy Hoon, who is committed to James Franklin at Penn State. And we're wondering what is going to happen for Cole Bergeron. Purdue, Georgia Tech stepped up big. And we, like you said, Georgia Tech really liked Cole Bergeron when he officially visited over the summer. Virginia Tech very narrowly won that recruiting battle. And I love to see that they circled back to Cole and they are getting someone who maybe is not the same athlete that Haynes King was coming out of Longview High School here in East Texas, but is a better passer than Haynes King was coming out of high school from St. Thomas More. Cole Bergeron had a fantastic senior season. We talked about it when Minnesota offered that we appreciated that they took notice of the kind of season that Cole Bergeron was having. You know this, and I know this, that around St. Thomas More, they are sky high and have been sky high about this young man for years. I remember the endorsement from Jamie Howard a couple of years ago about this is the next great quarterback to come through STM. And I'm a big Cole Bergeron fan. I think he has battled and navigated adversity and has stepped up time and time again. Do I think he was LSU or Alabama good? Maybe, maybe not. But I know that he can play in the ACC. I think he can play in the Big 12. I think he could play in a lot of different places. And I think his competitiveness, I think his growth, and I think his attitude going to Georgia Tech with Brent Key, who runs a hard, tough-nosed program, a lot like St. Thomas More, I think it's a great fit. I couldn't be happier for Cole Bergeron. And I think Georgia Tech found a little bit of a diamond in the rough out of Louisiana this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a little bit of a different athlete all around than Haynes King, but I like what you mentioned about the mentality, the toughness, the way that he carries himself and deals with adversity, just kind of unflappable in a lot of cases through the course of his career and over the course of different games. And he can move around a little bit too, and he's not shy to take a couple of hits to go get some tough yardage, and so they won't be afraid to put the ball in his hands in some spots. Let's talk before we have to get out of here about some of these dome matchups. I don't know if we're going to get a chance to talk more at length beforehand. We certainly will coming out of them after some of the dust settles, but we'll both be in there for those 3 days, catching 8 great state championships. The matchups are set coming out of this Friday night. On the non-select side, D1, Ruston versus Ouachita. D2, North DeSoto versus Iowa. D3, Gina versus Sterlington. D4, Haynesville versus Mangum. On the select side, D4, Riverside Academy versus Ascension Catholic. D3, Dunham versus Calvary Baptist. D2, St. Charles Catholic versus Archbishop Shaw. One of a few different district rematches that we have on the slate for this week, including the granddaddy of them all, D1 select, Edna Carr versus St. Aug. Anyone in the city of New Orleans who wasn't associated with another New Orleans school was kind of chomping at the bit for how electric the atmosphere can be for this thing. Carr always brings it. St. Aug's back for the first time since 1979 with our buddy Robert Valdez at the helm. Their only loss on the schedule this year was to that Edna Carr team over on the West Bank, and now we get to do it all over again on Poydras. I know that one stood out to you, but overall, looking at this slate of 8, what are you thinking as you start kind of setting your plans in motion to head to New Orleans?
Listen, first of all, you know that I was talking about it since this time yesterday, texting you and Fox 8 Locals First, Garland Gillen, about this Carr St. Aug matchup that I was dreaming of, that we're getting again. The Dome is going to be as packed as it was for Carr versus Landry Walker, and I think it's going to be an incredible Saturday afternoon atmosphere. I'm sure that game won't even kick off till 7, but I can't wait. Probably my biggest takeaway from the semifinal round is Arch Manning was the number 1 prospect coming out of his class, out of Newman, and could never get past LCA. 5-star quarterback. We've talked about playing in the lower classifications, and with the powerhouse that LCA has been for some time. What Elijah Haven did last night on the road in Lafayette, getting past LCA with an extremely not only productive but clutch performance in that environment. I think for since his closing seconds interception at the end of that state title game last year as a sophomore, he has been my MVP at the Future 50 in June. He has been obviously breaking records week in and week out for the Dunham School throughout his junior season. I think he's over 10,000 yards and 100 touchdowns. I mean, he's going to have every record that Derek Stingley doesn't have will belong to Elijah Haven before he graduates this time next year. But getting past a team like LCA, which has been so dominant for the span of this season, and now setting up a trip back to the Superdome, we talk about how special this 2027 class is. Pop Houston is committed to LSU. Malachi Ziegler is committed to SMU, and Elijah Haven is trending toward the Crimson Tide, which under Kalen DeBoer has asked Ty Simpson and Keelan Russell. They know what they're doing with the quarterback position. I think this is Elijah Haven's shining moment. That win on the road last night is enough for me, but I can't wait to see what he does in the Dome. I just think that he has had such a special season for the Dunham School. He has quietly been spectacular. Not a talker, doesn't put out any workouts or private, doesn't have to compete in every event and ask for notoriety. He just gets the job done, and he is as team first of a kid as we've seen. We know that he's missed things like competing in the Under Armour camp to help his basketball team, where he's just a role player out there. But he's the star quarterback for the Dunham School, and it's going to be a great matchup going against, we know, a stout Calvary Baptist team, which I know you love dating back to your time in Monroe for whatever reason. But I'm going to call it now. I'm going to write about it all week, and I hope to write about it in a couple of days when we see them in the primetime slot on Thursday night. But I think Elijah Haven is having the kind of season that proves that you can be a lower classification quarterback and you can still be that dude. We saw what Arch Manning did to close out the second half of his first year as a starter at Texas, and whether Elijah Haven plays for Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Auburn, or wherever. I don't think there's any questions about the kind of talent and upside that this young man has. And seeing what he did in Lafayette last night and what he's about to do in his second turn in the Dome has me absolutely giddy about this week, Jared.
Before anyone gets on you and thinks you don't know where Calvary Baptist is when you mention Monroe, that's more of an inside joke backstory that we'll have to share another time, because right now, as we kind of wrap it up, I'm sure Calvary out there in Shreveport is already finding a way to clip that little Elijah Haven love letter and put that on the bulletin board. They must have a video bulletin board somehow out there. They're showing all these kids for this. But yeah, it's going to be a great couple of games. You know, spoiler alert, I'm on LHSA Network again this year, going into the Superdome, talking about you know, I don't know if they want 5 to 7 guys to watch, and Elijah will certainly be one of those guys, a top quarterback on a national scale that is having a hell of a junior season. But again, great matchups all the way around. We're looking forward to covering all of them here this week in the Superdome. And until the next time we see you guys out there, thank y'all for tuning in, and y'all be well. He's Sam Spiegelman. I'm Jet Roser. This is Louisiana versus all y'all's Recruit That Boot. See you in the Dome.
Shout out to my guys, Wayne Stein and Hank Tierney. I'm bringing all the paper towels and Band-Aids for that bloodbath on Saturday. Don't you worry. Or Friday, whatever it is. I'll bring in the Band-Aids.
Yeah, those teams are going to beat the hell out of each other. And a bunch of these teams will. It's going to be some wars on that turf, man, for these 3 days. Looking forward to it.
Jared. I can't wait.